The message this morning is going to be slightly different from how I normally preach. Normally, as we would be going through this passage, I would just go verse by verse, line by line, and work through it. But I think that there is a danger in doing that, and it's this. We would see the trees and miss the forest. So what I would like to do this morning, which I think will be much more beneficial for you, and then as you go back and study this passage yourself, and you go and look at the individual parts, you go and look at the trees, I think it is going to make much more sense to you because you're going to have the big picture. So what I want to do is I want to explain what James is talking about, but I want to give you the 30,000-foot view. Remember, James is giving us a series of tests of faith. And so he's introducing wisdom here as a test of faith. But it's wisdom demonstrated in action. Do you remember earlier, James talked about faith, real, true, saving faith. And he said that true saving faith should be demonstrated in a transformed life by the works that you do. He said, I will show you my faith by my works. The works didn't create the faith created the works. He wasn't saved by the works, but somebody who is truly saved, born of the Spirit, will produce the fruit of the Spirit. The works of righteousness will necessarily fall from that. And the same is true of wisdom. True wisdom will be found in the life of the believer, and it will be seen in action. Now, if we were to just look at the details, the particulars, I'm afraid I may lose you in the details, and you're not going to see the big picture. What he's going to do is he's going to contrast two different types of wisdom. There is wisdom from above, or heavenly wisdom, and earthly wisdom. And the difference between the two is seen in the behavior of the individual. One leads to meekness, the other to arrogance, and so forth and so on. But what he's really doing is he's talking about true wisdom as contrasted with false wisdom. Now, this is actually going to be helpful because if you remember, I've reminded you that James is writing to Jewish Christians. And so he assumes in them an Old Testament background. But James also assumes knowledge of the Sermon on the Mount. Last week, we actually talked from the Sermon on the Mount about the wise and the foolish builders. And I attempted to show you the context of that narrative, which is salvation. How do I know that I am truly saved? On what foundation am I building my faith? Am I building my faith upon sand like a foolish person? Or am I building it upon Jesus Christ, the solid rock? And so I showed you that if you work before, the context shows a series of pairs. You have the good tree, the bad tree. You have the narrow gate and the wide gate. The broad way that leads to destruction, the narrow way that leads to life. You have the false teacher, the true teacher. You have these contrasts that are set up, and it's warning people to be very careful who you're listening to, what you believe, making sure that you are on the way that leads to life, that you have found the way of salvation. It is right there for those who have eyes to see. And the wise person, the one who has heavenly wisdom, will see God's way, God's plan of salvation through Jesus Christ, Believe on the name of the Lord Jesus and be saved. Here it's in the context of wisdom. How do I know that I have true faith? It will be demonstrated in true wisdom. Now, it's going to fluctuate from person to person. We're to pursue wisdom as part of the maturation process. But in the true believer, there's going to be increasing amounts of heavenly, true wisdom, biblical wisdom, and a decreasing amount of earthly wisdom. Now, one thing I need to mention before we get started is that in the Bible, we see two broad categories of wisdom. Now, I'm not talking about good versus bad. I'm talking about the fact that wisdom often is practical skill. So people who are good at administration or various things, this is wisdom. So for instance, you remember Solomon, when he was becoming king, God appeared to him in a dream and said, Solomon, you can ask for anything you want and I will give it to you. And Solomon asked for wisdom. But if you look in the context, there's a particular type of wisdom he's looking for, because he realizes that no human being in and of themselves can lead the nation of Israel. And so he particularly wants skill in leadership, in leading and shepherding God's people. He wasn't asking for moral, ethical wisdom in his own life. God said that he would be the wisest man who ever lived. God says he would be wiser than all those who came before and all those who would come after him. But if you look at his life, you see in the moral, ethical realm, more often than not, he was a fool. But as far as practical skill, there is no one who has ever been like him. James is not talking about practical skill in that way. He's talking about it in answering the big questions of life. And there is a human way of doing that, and there is a godly way of doing that. The human way leads to folly. It leads to destruction. The godly way leads to truth. It leads to life. So he's not talking about practical skill. He is talking here about navigating through the big questions in life. Now, the word wisdom in and of itself, the Old Testament word for wisdom really means skill. That's what the word means, skill. It's having the ability in practical matters to skillfully navigate practical matters. So we see in Solomon's life, he was able to do all kinds of amazing things, militarily, economically. He was able to solve problems, so much so that people from all over the world were coming to learn from him. He had skill. That's the basic meaning of this word. In Proverbs, the skill has primarily to do with skill in relation to truth and God. Truth and God. So that's why in Proverbs you often see a contrast between the wise person and the fool. The fool in Proverbs is not so much the ignoramus as it is the immoral person. So even in the book of Proverbs, it's navigating on the moral, ethical scale in relation to truth and God. Now, it's coupled with all kinds of different terms. Derek Kidner, in his fine little commentary on Proverbs, says that in the book of Proverbs, wisdom is often linked with synonymous terms such as instruction or training. So it's not a static term, but it has to do with correction and reproof. And one of the things he notes here is that this concept of instruction or training, it's not extramural study. And what he means by that is not just reading books and gleaning information. Now think about this for 1 second. Which generation in the history of the world has greater instant access to information than the present one? Almost everybody in this room could pull out their cell phone right now and find almost anything that they want. We have instant information. And yet, as far as wisdom is concerned, we live in one of the most ignorant generations in the history of the world. Not just ignorance of God's word, but the absurdity of how people think in the modern world. Young people today have been pulled so far down the path that we can't even relate to them anymore because it's like we're from two different planets. They've been indoctrinated with so much nonsense that we cannot comprehend how they could ever come to the conclusions that they do. And they can't understand for a second how we could believe what we believe. It's because they don't have wisdom anymore. They have information from a godless, perverse world. Now, Kidner says that it's not through extramural study, but it's for disciples only. In other words, instruction and understanding from God's word is given for the one who lives in relation to God. That's why oftentimes people who are not believers, who have no interest in the things of God, when they read the Bible, not only does it not make sense to them, but it's like it's bouncing off concrete. It just doesn't have any impact. It's because they're not seeking after anything. They're actually not inquiring after anything. They don't desire to actually learn from God's word. But wisdom and instruction go together. And instruction is for those who are actually seeking after God. It's for the disciple. We not only have instruction, but we have insight and understanding, or other terms that we see in Proverbs. We also see wise dealing. This can have the idea of being successful. Not from the world's perspective, but success is navigating the world correctly. It's avoiding hazards and things that will keep us from the goal. If the goal is Christ-likeness, it's avoiding those landmines and pitfalls and things that are going to keep us from becoming more like Christ. Those things that are going to cause a crisis of faith. And so we need a way of wise dealing with the situations that we confront. It also has the idea of shrewdness. Shrewdness in the Bible is often a bad term. Now you would know this term, for instance, when the serpent first appears in the garden in Genesis chapter 3. Okay, there's no good shrewdness in the serpent. The serpent is doing everything within his power, his capabilities, his powers of persuasion to get Eve to sin. So his shrewdness there is used for sinful, evil, nefarious ways. But shrewdness can be a good thing. Remember, we're to be as shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. So there's a sense in which the believer is to be shrewd in decision making, knowing what's good and what's bad, and how to bring about good results, how to bring about good, godly, positive things. Has the idea of discretion. And finally, we see just the word knowledge and learning. And it's learning the truth about God and the truth about life. And this is important because in the Bible, wisdom is a practical thing. It's about living, it's about doing. But you can't be wise and ignorant at the same time. Wisdom builds on the foundation of truth. And truth is information, it's knowledge. And so you need to know the truth. And then wisdom is applying that truth to life, to situations. So James is contrasting this skill in navigating life from two sources: the world and God. Now, for us, we have a mixture, which is unfortunate. And we're always going to have a mixture in this life. But the goal is to get the mixture so that it's daily increasing in more and more of godly wisdom and less of human wisdom until the Lord calls us home and that human wisdom is eradicated. Okay, earthly wisdom on the one side. So again, the 30,000-foot view. Now, earthly wisdom, heavenly wisdom are applied to categories such as morality, ethics, or what we just might call the epistemological questions, the big questions in life. What some have called the question of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Okay, where did we come from? These are big questions, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist? How did it come into existence? Where did life come from? What is life? What are human beings? Are we animals? Are we something different? These are huge questions. And the Bible provides answers, clear answers to all of those questions. But if you look at the world's answers, they're almost the exact opposite. So the world says that the universe sprang into existence out of nothing on its own, which, by the way, is completely illogical and irrational. Because nothing is nothing. Nothing can't become something. Nothing can't do anything. Nothing is nothing. There's an old saying, out of nothing, nothing comes. And that's common sense. And yet, the scientific community, because God is not allowed to be part of the equation, they say you cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What are you left with? If all you have is naturalism, time, space, matter, energy, then you have to come up with nonsense. Whereas the Bible says, in the beginning, an eternal, infinite God of his own free volition decided to create a universe. There's nothing illogical or rational about that. Nothing, zero. Where did life come from? Well, again, scientists, they want you to believe in a fairy tale. There's a law in science. Remember, laws are irrevocable. In science, a law has no known exceptions. If there's ever an exception, it is no longer a law. In science, there's a law called the law of biogenesis, which simply states life can only come from pre-existing life. Life cannot come from non-living chemicals. It cannot come from a rock, inanimate objects. Life must come from life. That's why Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of the shape of DNA, argued that it's aliens. They did it because he knew that it is impossible for life to have ever evolved on the earth. You have to have pre-existing life. But then the 5-year-old would say to Francis Crick, but Mr. Crick, where did the aliens come from? To which there would be no answer. But if you will not allow God in, then you allow nonsense in. Whereas the Bible says that God took the dust of the earth, fashioned it, breathed the breath of life into it, and it became a living soul. So the origin question is answered by the Bible rationally. But what does human wisdom offer? Absolute, utter foolishness, rubbish, nonsense. Meaning. Why is there meaning in life? Well, for the atheist, there is no meaning in life other than what you determine is meaningful. Carl Sagan, you remember his program from many, many years ago, Cosmos, and he's been followed by others like Richard Dawkins, and said all that exists is blind, pitiless chance. There is no meaning in life. None. Zero. That is no true meaning. Only what society or culture or the individual creates for themselves. So they again they're bankrupt when it comes to meaning. There is no meaning. Morality. There is no morality. It's a social construct. From the biblical perspective, morality comes from the lawgiver, God himself, who creates morality on the basis of his own nature and character. C.S. Lewis, by the way, has written one of the finest pieces on this in Mere Christianity, where he talks about the fact that there is a universal law throughout the world that it can't be given to instinct or herd mentality or anything, but must come from a universal lawgiver who we would call God. But again, for the atheist or from human wisdom, there is no morality. It's what society determines. And we have seen that flux in our culture. Things that our culture once said were immoral, today are moral. Because our culture is in flux and there is nothing for them to root morality to. There's no anchor for it. There's no bedrock. It's only personal choice. It's what the culture at large will accept. And we do see this in cultures around the world. In North America, we would say it would be immoral to eat people. But you go in different parts of the world, and cannibalism is a normal part of their culture. But from the biblical perspective, God is the one who determines what is right and wrong, and we are accountable to him. Finally, destiny. What's the atheist? What's the naturalistic perspective? You die and then that's it. That's the end. But the Bible says, no. This life is just the beginning. It's preparedness for the life to come, and the life to come is eternal. So these are the big questions really that James has in mind. It's navigating life in the big questions, because how you answer those big questions will determine how you're going to answer all the little ones. Why should Christians oppose abortion? It's the biblical teaching regarding life and the sanctity of life that God, as the lawgiver, has laid down in his word. So our foundation for how to answer that question is based upon the bigger questions of where do we determine meaning and morality. We see in the book of Ecclesiastes is a very, very interesting book. In fact, there's no other book in the Bible like it. You can read 95% of the book of Ecclesiastes, and what you're reading is everything not to do, not to believe. It's nonsense. The writer's telling you, I looked for wisdom here. I didn't find it. I looked for it here. Didn't find it. Look for it here. Okay, if Solomon is the author of it, and he is the richest, most powerful, wise man on the earth, he says, I went to look for it in pleasure, and I gave myself to pleasure. Didn't withhold anything. Okay, so you can imagine the debauchery that he engaged in. As a king who can do whatever he wants and has everything imaginable at his disposal. And he says he gave himself fully to that, experimented with everything imaginable. At the end, came up bankrupt, nothing. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. It's a chasing after the wind. Gave himself to pleasure in the sense of like alcohol. We would say he gave himself to drugs and alcohol and gave himself fully to that. The party life. He partied like no one has ever partied ever. When he was done, nope. What about possessions? Even today they talk about the the wealth of Solomon. He had everything you could have. No, that's meaningless, utterly. That doesn't lead anywhere. And so in the book of Ecclesiastes, it just goes from thing to thing to thing to thing. And he had it in the utmost abundance. Like nobody ever. And he comes to a dead end. Okay, I'm not going to give you his conclusion yet. We're going to come to that in a second. But basically, the book of Ecclesiastes presents what earthly wisdom looks like, where it leads. It leads to nowhere. It is a dead end. It has no value whatsoever. By the way, this thought just popped in my mind. This is why, if you are somebody who follows celebrities and the rich and the famous and all that, and you envy their life, you're just like Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. These people are on a dead-end run, a life of emptiness and meaningless, and that's what you want? If you want somebody whose life to pattern yours on, let me recommend Paul. Better yet, let me recommend Jesus. That needs to be the one whose life you want to emulate, to pattern yourself after. Turn to Job 28. I'm going to try to pick up the pace here a bit. Job 28. I'm going to read a few select verses here, so I don't want to give away the ending. Job 28, verses 12 and 13, and then 20 to 24. Verse 12. But where shall wisdom be found? Now, the first 11 verses are talking about how human beings are unlike any other earthly creature in their ability to find things. You don't see animals digging mines and finding gold, 1,000 feet below the earth and finding jewels and stuff like that buried deep. Human beings, it's amazing our ingenuity of what people are able to do. And that's what he's talking about here. To the lengths and breadth and depth that human beings will go and are capable of going to find these things. But then he says, but where shall wisdom be found? So human beings seemingly can find anything, but they can't find wisdom. And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living. Now, in the book of Ecclesiastes, I like to describe it this way. It's picturing life from the worm's eye view. So you can imagine the worm living a millimeter above the ground and what the worm sees as it looks around. The worm doesn't have the aerial view, the panoramic view. It can see so little around it. And that's us. In contrast, at the end, Solomon gives us the God's eye view that sees everything and sees it in its proper perspective. So when he's talking about humans can't find it, it's because we're like the worm looking around and we can never find it. We can't see it. Man does not know its truth. It is not found in the land of the living. In other words, it cannot be found down here. Verse 20. From where then does wisdom come? And where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air. Abaddon, that is destruction, and death say, we have heard a rumor of it with our ears. God understands the way to it. He knows the place, for he looks to the ends of the earth, and he sees everything under the heavens. The reason that human, earthly, quote-unquote, wisdom is bankrupt, it's because it really isn't wisdom in the first place. It's folly. And so Job makes it very clear to us that, listen, wisdom, real wisdom, cannot be found down here. So what kind of wisdom do you think our world has? What kind of wisdom does our government have? Do our leaders have? Do public educators who are not Christians have? The whole structure of society is built on earthly wisdom, which is utterly bankrupt. It's foolishness. It's folly. It's immoral. If you want to use James's terms, he is much, much stronger, because he actually says, this is verse 15, it is earthly, unspiritual, it is demonic. The only wisdom that the world can offer is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. And yet we hold it up as though what our world offers is this wonderful wisdom. James says it's not wonderful. It's deceptive because it's demonic. This word's only found here. It would be better rendered demoniacal. This word here is used of the fallen angels, the evil, unclean spirits. It comes from them. And who do they learn from? Satan, the father of lies, who's a liar from the beginning and a murderer. So if all that is permeating human wisdom is demonic, it's evil, then it doesn't offer the believer anything. Remember, we're not talking about practical skill. We're talking about answering the big questions, navigating through life, living a godly life. There is nothing the world can offer you that is going to make you more Christ-like. Nothing. It's going to do the opposite. Everything that you indulge in and embrace from the world is going to pull you from Christ. It's going to hamper your walk. It's going to lessen the depth of your spirituality. The more worldly you are, the less godly you will be. It's that simple. And James is going to be so blunt in context is to say, if there is too much of the world in you, it's because you're not a true believer in the first place, because the Spirit of God is not in you. Now let's contrast that, because enough of the bad stuff. What's the good stuff? What are we supposed to have? Well, if you're still in Job 28, Job says this. Verse 28, and he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn away from evil, that is understanding. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Turn over a few pages to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 1 verse 7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Chapter 2, verse 5. Then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. Chapter 9 and verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. We find similar things in Proverbs 14:27, 16 verse 6, 19 verse 23. Turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Okay, we saw that 95% of the book is being told where wisdom isn't found. Well, we're told where it is found. Now listen, from verse 1 of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 through chapter 12, verse 12 is all the earthly perspective that leads nowhere. And if you want to know what the book of Ecclesiastes is about, all you have to do is read verses 13 and 14. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Okay? He found out for you. You do not have to go down all of those foolish paths that he went. He's telling you they're dead ends. What's the conclusion? Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. What is the meaning in life? Fear God and keep his commandments. What is wisdom? Fearing God and keeping his commandments. So what he did is in 12 chapters, he showed you every dead end that the world seeks after. And he's telling you, listen, I gave myself fully to that. You can be rest assured. It doesn't lead to happiness or prosperity or success. It leads to death. Let me just tell you the conclusion. Fear God and keep his commandments. Now you notice something. In the Old Testament, wisdom is equated with the fear of the Lord. Now, if you look in the Old Testament, the fear of the Lord would be very similar to the New Testament concept of salvation by faith alone in Christ alone. The one who fears God is the one who knows God and relates properly to God. Okay, fear in the Old Testament has a spectrum. It can go from utter terror to reverence and worship. That's the spectrum. So on the one hand, remember James says that the demons believe and shudder. The demons are terrified of God because they know what their end is. Remember that Jesus comes to these demons and they said, have you come to torment us before the appointed time? In other words, they know there's an appointed time. They know there's a day of reckoning for them. And they're saying, have you come to judge us before that appointed time? They know. So there is a sense in which we should be terrified of God. If you are going to willfully sin, you should be afraid of a holy God and the consequences for your sin. The Bible says that God disciplines the one he loves. And so there is a holy wrath toward the sin, even in the believer, where you're not going to get away scot-free. God's going to judge you. We talked about this a few weeks ago. God may not zap you, and one person said to me, you should have said, but he might. Okay, because we have biblical examples. Ananias and Sapphira, for instance. They lied to the Holy Spirit. They dropped dead. Okay, we read about in 1 John a sin that leads to death. Hebrews chapter 6 talks about the same thing. So there are rare occurrences. Today we're going to be looking at the Lord's Supper. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says, I don't have any good thing to say about you and how you're going about your business. And he said, the way in which you're treating one another, he said, that's why some of you are sick and some have already fallen asleep. They've already died as judgment for their sin. And that's why the warning about examine yourself before you approach, because you may be incurring the judgment of God. So there is a fear that even believers should have. But remember, love casts out fear. If we truly love God and we're obeying God, there is no fear. But if we go to the far spectrum, what should the fear of the Lord lead to? Praise and delight and worship. That's where we want to get to. We want to get where the impulse of our soul is just crying out to worship God, to praise Him, to delight in Him, to meditate on Him, that every thought is taken captive, that He's just a consuming passion and desire. So the fear of the Lord for the believer is somebody who has entered into that saving relationship with Him through Jesus Christ and then embraces God at the deepest level. As Tozer said, having found God, we pursue Him all the more. In other words, we're driven daily deeper and deeper into this hunger and longing for God. Remember, David cried out, when can I come into your presence? It was as though he was longing for death because life was separating him from God. That's where we need to get to. And so Job tells us, Proverbs tells us, Ecclesiastes tells us that wisdom is something that is connected with our relationship to God, to truth, because it's linked in those passages to understanding. It's about truth and knowing who God is, and then relating rightly to God in this life. Every decision you make is a reflection on your relationship with God. How hard you work is a reflection on your relationship to God. We're told, do everything as unto the Lord. Whether you eat or drink, it doesn't matter how small or mundane it is or how big it is. Everything is to be done to the glory and praise of God. And so the fear of the Lord, what James is saying is that, listen, the believer who is indwelt by the Spirit, whose life is brand new in Christ, and the Spirit as an active agent in that person's life, will change how you think, how you act, what you do, what you love, what you long for, all of this. And so James is probably interacting with people in his church who thought they were wise. We all know people who think that they're wise. And maybe they are. But don't judge somebody's wisdom on the basis of the information they spew from their mouth. There are all kinds of people who know way more about the Bible than any of us, can quote chapter and verse, can explain intricacies of theology, and yet their life is a moral stain. It's all up here. It's academic. James says that's not wisdom. True wisdom will be demonstrated in a transformed life, and that's the life of a believer. So much so that Jesus said, it is the wise person who builds upon the rock. And remember, he says, who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. We can hear Jesus' words, and that's the end of it. Conclusion. We need to seek after godly wisdom. James has already told us, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives without finding fault and will give in abundance. In other words, if you earnestly ask God for wisdom, as defined this morning as godly. By the way, just a little tidbit of information here. When James says wisdom from above, there's an interesting Greek term that he uses. Nicodemus appears to Jesus in John chapter 3, and Jesus said, Nicodemus, you must be born again, or from above. The Greek word there is anothein. You must be born anothein, which can mean again, or it can mean from above. That's the word that James uses. He's talking about salvation comes from above, comes from God. Wisdom comes from above, it comes from God. So just note that down in your Bible, that the word he uses is the same word that Jesus says that we must be born again. We must be born from above. So we are told, if any of you lacks wisdom, which is all of us, let him ask of God, who gives in abundance. God's not going to just give you a drop. He's going to give you more than enough. More than enough. But here's the caveat. How does God normally give you wisdom when you ask for it? Thank you. Through his word. What God is going to do is, as you're saturating yourself and feeding your soul on his word, he's going to give you spiritual insight for your soul. Remember, it's living and active. It's not just ink on a page. This book is like no other book. It is the word, the mind, the heart of God, and it is living and active. It's supernatural. And God says, if you pray, he will give you wisdom. And I don't think that that's just God plunking thoughts in your head, because how can you substantiate those thoughts? I remember years and years ago, John MacArthur was very blunt in this. He said, because all kinds of people, there was a movement, and it's still going on today, where people were trying to tell you to pray and ask God for extra biblical revelation. I want a word from the Lord. That was the big thing. I want a word from the Lord. How will you ever know that that came from God? That didn't come from the devil? It didn't come from yourself. And MacArthur was right. He says the only way that you can actually know if something is from God is if it's found in the Bible. So if you want wisdom, the place to find it is to mine it from God's word and to pray that the Spirit of God would give you discernment and utterance and understanding of that word, not only what it means, but how to live it out. And so pray every time you open God's word, and please read God's word. Read it daily. Read it in abundance. But don't read it without having prayed first. That the Spirit would open your mind and your heart, that your soul would be fed by God. This is manna from heaven. One other thing. Learn from those who exhibit godly wisdom. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. If you see Christ in people's lives, imitate that. Find people that are worth emulating. Sadly, there are fewer and fewer and fewer But that's why, read missionary biographies. Read about the life of Hudson Taylor and Adoniram Judson and Amy Carmichael and people like that. C.T. Studd. There's all these people, great men and women of God, who set an example for us to follow of what it is to hunger for God. I was talking to some people this week, and they said my favorite writer by far, and they were surprised. They thought I was going to say John MacArthur, but it's not. He's a distant second. A.W. Tozer by far, because boy, does he feed my soul. Here was a man that loved God more than anything. And he shows people how to love God. That's what we need. Pursue God and he will give you wisdom. The fear of the Lord. That's what we need to pursue. That is wisdom. So we're done for today. That's the 30,000 foot view. If you read the rest of James 3, he's going to live different ethical, moral things that characterize the lives of the wise and the foolish, those who have earthly wisdom and those who have heavenly wisdom. So we can look at the specifics, but I want you to see the big picture. And the big picture is, James says that believers possess wisdom, the fear of the Lord, but you need to pursue it daily so you have more and more and more of it, and at the same time you're doing house cleaning where you're getting rid of the earthly wisdom. Let's face it, there's way too much of the world in our lives. Way, way too much. And it creeps in and it affects how we think, what we love, what we value. That all needs to go. Get rid of it. But you need to push it out through God's word. Push it out. What we need is God's word to act as one of those pressure washers that rips off all the bad stuff. And may God help us do that. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for your word, which is truth. Jesus said, Father, sanctify them by the word. Your word is truth. And so if we want wisdom, truth, and knowledge of God, it is found through your word. May we hunger for your word. May we find it sweeter than honey, even honey from the comb. May we read it and meditate upon it and do what it says. May it be the authority in of our lives that we would submit to it, not to our own wants and desires and emotions and things which are worldly, demonic. But the word, may we be people of the book. Bless us, Lord. You know each heart and each life where they're at. Move us, Lord, to long for the truth, to be wise. Lord, change us and transform us. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.